Well, as Seventh-day Adventists, we are a religious minority. Most other Christians go to church on the first day of the week, of course, and we go to church on the seventh day of the week. And so, as a religious minority, that has always given us a great interest in the subject of religious liberty. Now, I know you guys, I think, watched the video for the religious liberty sermon or something already, but you're going to get a second one anyway today. But it's a good, because it is an ongoing project. It's an important one because we understand that the Bible's position is one of religious liberty, that there should be religious freedom. So let's look at a few verses that kind of go into that. Let's go to Matthew 16:24. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." So where do we see the concept of religious liberty in that verse? Anyone tell me? That, okay, they're taking an action. I think that, what? There's choice, right. And how do we know there's choice? What does Jesus begin saying? What's the first word he uses there? If. If. He says if. So if implies that there is choice. If there wasn't, if there was no choice, there could be no if. It's like either you're doing this or you're not doing this, whatever has been predetermined or however it was happening. But no, Jesus says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him do so. So Jesus believes in religious liberty. Doesn't believe in trying to force himself upon anyone. If we go to Revelation 3, verse 20. Revelation 3:20, here in Christ's words to his final church upon earth, the church of Laodicea, verse 20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and he with me." So there we see that word if again. And we see Jesus presents himself as he's knocking at the door. He doesn't have a battering ram. He's not forcing his way inside. But no, he's a gentleman. He knocks at the door and he waits for us to respond. We have a choice. When we feel Jesus drawing us towards him, we can either say, okay, or we can say, no, I don't want to have a relationship with you right now. We can leave him standing at the door if we choose to do so, because it's an if, it's a choice that we have. Let's go now to John 12, verse 32. John chapter 12, verse 32. "And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself." Jesus says he will draw people to himself. Doesn't say that he's going to go and drag them kicking and screaming to himself, but he will draw people to himself. And if we go to Jeremiah 31:3, we see how God draws us. Jeremiah 31, verse 3. "The Lord has appeared of old to me, saying, Yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness I have drawn you." How does the Lord draw us? With loving kindness. Again, he doesn't force himself upon us. He presents his love towards us. And of course, where do we most clearly see the love of God manifested for us? At the cross. Jesus' sacrifice of himself upon the cross for us demonstrates God's great love for each one of us. And so God demonstrates his love, his goodness towards us, and that moves upon our hearts and draws us towards him. But we can resist that. We can refuse to be drawn. We can refuse to go. We don't have to respond because God has given us a choice. God created humans as free moral agents. Now, He desires for us to choose to be in a loving relationship with Him. But He doesn't force a loving relationship upon us. In fact, you can't force a loving relationship. That's why He gave us freedom of choice. If there was no freedom of choice, we would be robots. He could have just programmed us so we could, do this. When He says this, we'd do that and whatever. But you can't have a real relationship with a robot. Because no matter how lifelike you make the robot, no matter what kind of AI programming you can put into it, artificial intelligence, so it can talk back to you and stuff, it's only repeating back what it's been programmed into it. So for those of you who are married, would you like to, if you could put a chip into your spouse's head to make them love you, would you want to do that? No. Because would they really be loving you? No, if you just push the button, now they love me. No, they could act in a loving manner towards you, but it would all be programmed. It wouldn't be real. It wouldn't be genuine. God doesn't desire some programmed response from us. He desires to be in a genuine relationship with us. And so God created us with freedom of choice, and then He had a plan in place that if we misused that freedom of choice, He had a plan to still be able to have a relationship with Him. And of course, our first parents in Eden misused that freedom of choice and plunged our world into sin, but God had a plan and was ready to do it. And He demonstrates His love to woo us, to call us into a relationship with Him. So that's our first principle, that God gives us free will, that religious liberty, freedom of choice to worship or to not worship, and how we worship is given to us freely by God. Now, second principle I want to look at before we get into looking at Revelation is that God has established government. Government is given to us by God, and government is given with a specific purpose. So let's go to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13, and we'll begin with the first verse. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister to an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So God established government for what purpose? To restrain evil. Now, if we lived in a perfect, unfallen world, there'd be no need for human governments. Because everyone would always do that which is good. But the fact is that we are born into a fallen world. We're all born in this world with fallen natures. And we all sometimes do things that are evil. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. Some people choose to do evil on a regular basis. That's their lifestyle. And the government's job is to stop people from doing evil. When we're talking about evil, we're talking about doing things that harm other people. And so stealing from them, beating them up, murdering them. Those are the types of things that government has the job to keep people from hurting other people, from practicing evil on others. So to promote good, to restrain evil is the legitimate function of government here according to Paul. Peter agrees with him. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll begin with, we'll look at verses 13 and 14. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. So again, what is the purpose of government? To punish evildoers and to praise those who do good. That's what government is supposed to do. Because we live in a fallen world, God has granted and put in place that we should have governments to do that function. And, we look at the words of Paul and Peter, and, it's like, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. Everyone needs to be subject unto the governing authorities. And, in these two passages, we don't really see much in the way of exceptions. And so we say, well, does that mean anything government tells us to do that we should just go ahead and do that? Well, of course, when we study the Bible, we want to see everything the Bible has to say about a subject. So let's go ahead now and go to Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, and we're going to be looking at verse 29. The setting is, that the apostles had been preaching about Jesus. And so they had been brought in before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And they were trying to figure out what to do with them. And finally said, well, we're going to let you go, but when you go out, don't preach about Jesus anymore. That's our instructions to you. Well, what did they do? They went out, and what did they do? They preached about Jesus. So they're brought back in before the council and said, didn't we tell you not to preach about Jesus? And you've spread word of him all over, and you're making us look guilty for crucifying him. You're going to start a rebellion against us, and so we need to do something here. You guys just didn't listen. Verse 29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So, in this case, the council was telling them to do something. They said, don't preach about Jesus. Now, did the apostles have any instructions that they were to preach about Jesus? Well, the Great Commission. They're to go into all the world, make disciples, and teach them. So that they had a specific instruction from God that they were to be Jesus' witnesses and take the message of Jesus to the world. So God said, do this. The government said, don't do this. And so what did they say? We must obey God rather than government. So sometimes government oversteps its God-appointed bounds. It begins to try to enforce things that shouldn't be enforced. So rather than just restraining evil behavior, it goes and starts either saying you shouldn't do something that God has told you to do, or you should do something that God has told you not to do. And in those cases, when the instructions of government to us conflict with what God has told us to do, we have to obey God. But in general, as Christians, we should be known as law-abiding citizens. In other words, and Paul and Peter, they talk about, if you're going to be punished, make sure it's because you're following what God says, not just because you're just breaking the law. If you go and beat your neighbor up, that's, saying, hey, I don't have to follow the law. No, God doesn't say to beat your neighbor up. And so if you go to jail for that, it's your own fault, and you're not being a witness for Christ in that. And so we can think of a couple of examples in the Bible where the government has either told us to do something that we shouldn't or to not do something that we should, and both of those are in the book of Daniel. The first one is in Daniel chapter 3. We have the story of the three Hebrews in the fiery furnace. And so King Nebuchadnezzar didn't like the information that he'd gotten as recorded in Daniel chapter 2. God had sent him a vision of what the future was going to be. And this metal man made out of this image made out of 4 metals, and it had a head of gold and the chest and arms of silver and so on. And it said, Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom of Babylon is this head of gold, but you're going to be followed by another kingdom. Well, he didn't like that message from God, so he created an image made of all gold from head to foot, basically saying, no, my kingdom's going to stand forever. In order to prove your loyalty to my kingdom, he'd gotten all the government officials from all over the empire together, and they were all going to have to bow down and worship the image. Now, what does God say about worshiping images? Well, we're not supposed to, second commandment. We're not supposed to make graven images and bow down to them. So there's a specific word from God to not do that. So here we find Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the king is saying, you must bow down and worship. If you don't, you're going to be killed. And God says, don't bow down and worship. And so they chose not to bow down and worship. So they're brought before the king, and they're respectful. They're not just in your face, you can't make me do this or anything like that. So even if we have to come in before government because we're following God, we still need to go before them with a meek, quiet, but confident spirit. You know, we don't act rebellious in the sense that, hey, you can't make me do that. They didn't act like that. They were respectful to him. He said, hey, I'm going to give you guys another chance. Said, don't, King, you don't need to do that, because we're still not going to bow down. And says, you know, our God, whom we worship, he is able to deliver us. But even if he chooses not to, we still will not bow down and worship the image. And so they were following God because they were in a loving relationship with God, and said, hey, we know God can save us, but he may choose not to, and that's okay. It's, you know, we're not just going to not worship because we're sure God's going to save us. No, either way, we're not going to bow down and worship, because we have to follow God instead of following your human-made laws. Now, God did, of course, choose to save them in that instance. God doesn't always choose to save people when they're standing up for the truth. That, you know, we can look down through the history. There have been many martyrs for the truth who have given their lives. And then, of course, if we go on to Daniel chapter 6, we have Daniel in the lion's den. And there we have the opposite. In Daniel 3, we had government trying to enforce something that was forbidden. In Daniel chapter 6, we have the government forbidding something that we should do. So Daniel's habit is to bow at his window, facing towards Jerusalem, and pray every day. Well, they couldn't find anything else to get him on. He had enemies, political enemies. They didn't like that this Jewish, prisoner of Babylon was now being put in charge of things in the Persian Empire. The empires even switched, and he's still in government. They didn't like him. So they try to figure out anything they can get on, and said, well, he's perfect in the sense that he doesn't cheat, he doesn't lie, he doesn't skim money off the government accounts or anything. They couldn't find anything. Daniel kept the law in the sense that, he was a law-abiding citizen of Persia. And said that, well, if we're going to get him, it has to do something with his relationship to God. So they get the king to, they butter him up and say, hey, king, we just really like you, and to honor you, we've written up this law, won't you sign it, that no one can pray to any other god except for you for a month. King signs the law. Daniel continues to pray. Now, is there anything wrong with praying in your room where no one can see you? No. But Daniel's habit was well known already that he prayed, and so he didn't just give in and say, I'm just going to sneak and pray in my closet until the month is up. No, he needed to show that he was honoring God rather than men, that the government had overstepped its bounds here. And so he went ahead and prayed, and of course he's taken in, the king's so sorry, can't figure a way to, because according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, once the king signed it, even the king couldn't change the law, and so he was put into the lion's den, and he was delivered from that. So there we have two examples of that sometimes the government tries to interfere with things that God has given us instructions about. And when it does that, we have to obey God rather than the government. But in general, we should be like Daniel. We should be law-abiding citizens, where the only thing if they can get anything on us, it has to do something about our relationship to God. Other than that, we should be squeaky clean. That's what we're called to be for the sake of Christ. We don't want to give Christ a black eye in the public opinion because, oh yeah, those Christians, you see what they did this or they did that or whatever. No, we want to be known as, people that want what is best for our society, that are law-abiding citizens, but that we don't compromise when it comes to what God has told us to do or not to do. Okay, let's go to Revelation 13 now. We've kind of laid down some basic principles of religious liberty and government. And in Revelation 13, we find this beast coming up from the land. Revelation 13:11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. So just a quick study. I think most of us are probably familiar with the prophetic interpretation, but we want to see, who is this land beast? Well, the first thing we notice if we read the whole chapter is that this beast comes up from the land, but the beast that's in the first half of the chapter came up from the sea. And we see in Revelation 17, it tells us that the sea represents peoples and nations, large groups of people. And so the first beast comes up out of the teeming nations. So therefore the second beast comes up from land, which is okay, the opposite of teeming nation, so a relatively unpopulated area, perhaps. And then, if we go back to Revelation 12, verse 16, Revelation 12:16 says, "But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth." The woman represents the church. And so Revelation 12 there is talking about the period of persecution during the Middle Ages, but that the earth would help the woman. So the earth or the land was a source of refuge for the church during persecution. We see that this first beast that comes up out of the sea was going to have a deadly wound. That's Revelation 13, verse 3. "And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast." And then down to verses 9 and 10, "If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints." So this first beast power that comes up from the sea, who in Revelation is just generally termed the beast, as we look at that, we understand as we study that, it ties back in with the beasts of Daniel 7. In fact, all the different heads and things of the beasts mentioned in Daniel 7 are mentioned as being on this beast. And so it's the same as the little horn power of Daniel 7. And we understand that the prophetic fulfillment of that was in the papacy. So that that this represented the papal power, who was to be given power to persecute God's people for 42 months, for 3.5 times, for 1,260 days. And then it loses its power to persecute. And so that power of persecution was given to the papacy by the Emperor Justinian. And he had made a decree that the Pope was the head of the church, and that the Pope would have the power to deal with heretics. Heretics are those who teach something religiously that doesn't agree with what the established church once taught. But the Pope was not in a position to really be able to put that decree into enforcement, because at the time Italy was occupied by a Germanic tribe that were Arians. And so they didn't accept the Catholic version of Christianity. And so as long as they were controlling things, the Pope couldn't do anything. So Justinian sends an army to free Italy from these Arian Christians. And in 538, the Ostrogoths had been besieging Rome. They came and broke the siege of the Ostrogoths in 538, which now began to give the Pope ability to begin to implement Justinian's decree. And so that was 538. So 1,260 days, prophetic day equals a literal year. 1,260 years later brings us to 1798. The French general Berthier has entered into Rome with instructions to take the Pope captive, and that when he dies, there's not to be another Pope. Now, of course, we know eventually there is another Pope, but at the time, this was the papacy receiving its deadly wound. It had lost its ability to directly bring persecution to people. So we would expect then that this next beast, which is presented right after it's talking about the deadly wound and so on, would be rising to prominence around 1798. And then we saw that it initially has some lamb-like qualities. It has 2 horns like a lamb. Now the word lamb in the book of Revelation, this is the only place that it does not refer to Jesus. So that's significant here. So that tells us that there's something about this nation, at least to begin with, that has certain Christ-like properties here. And it talks about that there are 2 horns. Horns, again, represent powers. And so a nation where there would be 2 sources of power. And because it would have a separation of church and state, it would be republicanism and Protestantism. That republicanism is that there would be a government put in place by the people, and Protestantism where a church makes its own choices about how it understands the Word of God and how to worship. It would be a country without a king and a church without a pope. And so Of course, then, what nation was rising from a relatively unpopulated area that had provided refuge for those that were persecuted around the year 1798 and had some Christ-like properties recognizing religious freedom, separation of church and state? Of course, the United States of America. So, I want to read here from Great Controversy, page 295. In that grand old document, which our forefathers set forth as their Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, they declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees in the most explicit terms the inviolability of conscience. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any officer of the public trust under the United States. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So our country was established with these religious principles that church and state should be separate. They had seen what had happened during the Middle Ages when the church controlled the state and used the power of the state to enforce its own dictates. And they said, we're not going to have that here. There's going to be a separation. It's a matter of conscience. Who you worship, how you worship, when you worship, that's between you and God. That's not the business of the state. So they set up a state that the business of the state is to what? Restrain evil, promote that which is good. And so that's how our country was set up to begin with. But of course, our verse doesn't end with two horns like a lamb. It says, and spoke like a dragon. So the prophecy points that there's going to come a change to the United States. That it's going to go from its Christ-like qualities, that it's going to begin to have dragon-like qualities. It's going to begin to speak as the dragon. Let's continue reading in from verse 13. I'm sorry, verse 12. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. So from having two horns like a lamb to speaking as a dragon, making an image of the beast. Well, what was the beast power within the Middle Ages? Church controlling the state in Middle Ages Europe, where the church could say, you know, you're teaching something that's against us, so we're going to have you, the government, go burn you at the stake. Heresy was a crime. It was a government crime. So if you disagreed with the church said, hey, he's disagreeing with us, then the government would throw you in jail and maybe burn you at the stake. We see that is going to be recreated again one day here in the United States. That there is going to come a time when there's going to be enforced worship. Worship, or there's going to be consequences. Can't buy and sell. So first we're going to try to put some economic pressure on you. And if that doesn't work, well, then eventually there's going to be a death penalty. If you won't worship, you're going to be put to death. So we see that prophecy points to that there's going to be coming a change in the United States. And a couple of quotes here. First from Testimonies, Volume 5, page 451. Our country shall repudiate every principle of its Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government. And then Great Controversy, page 441. This repudiation constitutes a final rejection of all that is unique to the American experience and endeavor. It is an ultimate disavowal of the nation's manifest destiny. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. And then from the Ellen White comments in the Bible commentary on Revelation 14:9 through 12, when the very principles that underlie national greatness and prosperity are cast aside as obsolete and as belonging to an older, isolationist and agrarian age, national apostasy will be followed by national ruin. It talks about repudiating every principle of its constitution. So we said we were established as a country that recognized rights. Our Declaration of Independence says that we've been given certain rights. Who are we given rights by? By God. And that's an important thing to remember. We do not get our rights from government. And I was even listening to a religious liberty sermon by Mark Finley this week, and he talked about that the Constitution gives us certain rights. Now, the Constitution does not give you any rights. It is put in place to guarantee the rights that you already possess. Our rights come from God here. And so we have the First Amendment to the Constitution. The first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. There was some discussion on, do we need a Bill of Rights or shouldn't we have a Bill of Rights? And some said, well, the government can't do anything that it's not specifically allowed to do in the Constitution, so why do we need one? But some said, well, maybe it's still a good idea. And so some said, we're not going to sign off on the Constitution until we're guaranteed there's going to be a Bill of Rights in there. And the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it was mentioned that, it's not just religious issues, but that all of our constitutional freedoms are going to come under assault. It says it's going to repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant Republican government. Well, as we look at some of the things going on in our society today, we can begin to see that there are some threats to some of our constitutional freedoms. There's supposed to be freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Well, we have now those who feel that they should be able to determine what you say and what you don't say. So you don't say, if we don't like what you say, we're going to put you in Facebook jail. You're off. You can't post anything for a week or a month or whatever. It depends on how many times and what you've said to offend them. Even if you're the President of the United States, if we don't like what you're saying, we're going to block you. Now, I don't care whether you agree with the previous president or not. When there are those that are trying to keep the President of the United States from being able to communicate directly with the people without being filtered through the media, that's problematic. So that's a violation of his freedom of speech, I would say. And if they want to control the press, they want to, everyone works together. That let's all give one picture of what gets said and shared. You don't like it? Well, go somewhere else. Well, so some people started going somewhere else. Well, we need to do something about that. So, we're going to take your app off of our app store so you can't have your app on the phone. Well, we're going to do one better. We're the ones who host them on the web. We're going to kick them off. And so if you don't like it and you want to go somewhere else, too bad, there's no place else to go. So if you don't want to say what we want you to say, then just sit down and shut up. That's the attitude that we see being portrayed in our society. So we see more and more of our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms being eroded. Now, they're not all gone, and some people, sit there and it's the end of the world. Well, we're getting close to the end of the world, but we're not there yet. But, and I would still rather live in the United States than any other country on this globe, because we still have far more freedoms than most of the people in the world. Our freedoms are, they haven't been eroded away completely yet. And so we know it's coming. We see the beginnings of it starting to happen, that you got to close your churches down, or you can only have a certain number of people in your churches, and you all have to wear. If you don't wear masks, you can't go to church. And so there's control. And now that luckily the Supreme Court spoke up and said, no, you can't do that. That's a violation of the First Amendment. But we see these different things out there, and they're drawing closer. And so as we see those, and then we can look at the other signs we see happen. You know, wars, rumors of wars, pestilence. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. And so we see all of these things beginning to happen that point to that we're getting closer to the end. We see that the United States is beginning to speak as a dragon, and we know that it will culminate in enforced worship with a death penalty. So we know where we're going. We can see where we're at, so what do? Well, we don't just sit there and go, woe is me. No, we realize that time is getting short. Well, what do you do when you have shortness of time? Well, let's see what Satan does when he has a short time. Let's go back to Revelation chapter 12, verse 12. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. So Satan's busy because he knows he only has so much time to work. So if we understand that time is getting short, shouldn't we be working just as hard as Satan is working? Now is not the time to be sitting back and just kind of drifting along and say, well, I'll just wait till, just waiting for Jesus to get here. No, we're not here just to wait till Jesus to get here. We're here with a purpose. And so we need to continue to promote religious liberty. And I'm thankful for our religious liberty department that, we'll send people in to talk to Congress when they're proposing laws that could affect that, and that can provide lawyers when there's cases that need people to protect their religious liberty. So we're called upon to keep the banner of religious liberty lifted up. Well, why? Just so we don't have to suffer persecution? No, it's not for selfish reasons. It's excuse me. It's because we want to have as much freedom as possible so that we can share the gospel as easily as possible. So while we still have the freedoms that we have, we need to take advantage of them, and we need to be out there sharing the three angels' messages with people. That's why we're here. We want to get as many people ready as possible to meet Jesus when he returns. God created us to have a loving relationship with him. He instituted the plan of salvation when sin came in to be able to reestablish a loving relationship. He wants everyone to be saved, but not all will choose to be so. But our job is to invite as many as possible, to share as many as possible about the love of God, about his plan for their lives, that they would, as they see his goodness and his love, they would be drawn towards him and respond positively. So that as many as possible are ready to meet Jesus. So let's share Jesus with others. Let's share the love with others. Let's uphold religious liberty and realize that there will come the time when we do have to just stand up and say, I'm going to obey God rather than man. If you're going to put me in jail, fine. If you're not going to let me buy and sell, okay. If you're going to put me to death, I'm still not going to change my mind. That's the experience before us. And it can be scary when we focus on that, but we focus on Jesus. Jesus is there for us. He's there to strengthen us. The Holy Spirit is there to empower us to warn this world and to strengthen us to endure all that the world has for us and prepare us for the second coming of Christ.